In this video, we're gonna have a discussion about the scoping of IFRS 16 leases. So before understanding IFRS 16, I want to explain you something. Whenever you read any standard on IFRS, the first thing you need to see the scoping, which means or which specifies what is the ambit or what is the area that covers IFRS, any specific IFRS that you read. For example, the scoping part specifies, okay, suppose I'm reading IFRS 16. So when I read scoping, it specifies the area, the items that are covered by IFRS 16, as I've studied IFRS 16. So scoping generally specifies the areas covered by a particular standard. So in this video, we're gonna have a discussion about IFRS 16's lease requirements, scoping part. So IFRS 16 is primarily applied for all leases except the following. The first thing, if you're able to see, I've highlighted the term called leases. What I mean by this, I mean IFRS 16 specifies or defines what do you mean by a lease. It specifies a definition for lease. It provides what we call it as a lease. We do not need to dig into dictionary and what's the dictionary meaning of leases, because IFRS 16 has its own terminologies and own areas and own definitions what is called as lease and what are covered under IFRS 16. So we will dig down in detail in other videos what we call it as leases. So for this video we are only discussing about the scoping part. So let's start the journey. So as I said, IFRS 16 is to be applied for all the leases except the following. I'm not talking anything on what do you mean by leases. I'm discussing on the scoping part. So it's applied to everything which falls the definition of leases as per 16, but the followings are excluded. The first one is leases to explore for or use of minerals, oil, natural gases under and similar non regenerative resources. Why it is excluded? Because this is covered, the first definition, it is covered by IFRS 6. We do have a specific standard to deal with this. IFRS 6 deals with these items that has been mentioned under the first exception. So any leases which are related to oil, natural gas, for example, any mine fields or any oil fields where we used to dig oils. So these are not covered under IFRS 16 because it has been specifically covered under IFRS 6. Second point, leases of biological assets covered under IAS 41. Okay, now here this definition is very simple. Any biological asset which is covered under IAS 41 is excluded from leases. Now there is one general doubt on bearer plants. This is amendment, right? Bearer plants, because bearer plants now been excluded from IAS 41, and they have been moved to IAS 16 as PP&E. So here what they are saying is this, as per the second exception, IAS under all the biological assets covered under IAS 41, which means bearer plants does not covered under IAS 41. They are covered under IAS 16. So the point is, bearer plants are covered under IAS 16, so they also covers under IFRS 16. So we concluded that bearer plants will be a part of IFRS 16 because bearer plants does not fall under IAS 41 anymore. They fall under IAS 16 as PP&E. So this definition is very simple now, right? Let's drill down to the third point. Service concession arrangement under IFRIC 12. Okay, I'm not gonna I want to prepare a separate video for IFRIC 12, what IFRIC 12 exactly is. So IFRIC is just an interpretation. It's not a standard itself. It's just an interpretation, but do falls part of IFRS. Remember in my first video, IFRS covers IFRICs also. So as per this, any IFRIC 12 arrangements are excluded, which means any for better understanding, I want to give you an example. Think about a PPP, yeah, public private partnership. Public-private partnership. The best example is, I want to build up an airport. I want to build an airport. For example, what the government will do, government will raise a tender and give the contract to build up the airport to, for example, XYZ Limited. They will build, they will operate, they will lease it, and they will transfer it. It basically based on any bolt or boot model. Like for example, they will build it and then they will collect the tolls and everything, and they will transfer it to the government after 25 years, for example, after 25 years. So this is basically kind of lease, right? We are paying it and we are getting some benefits. One may specify it as a lease, but standard specifically excludes them, like any arrangement which are form part of IFRIC 12 does not fall under IFRS 16. The fourth and the fifth part is related to the intangible assets. So I'm going to go through them once more. Licenses of intellectual properties granted by a lessor within the scope of IFRS 15. IFRS 15 deals with revenue from contract with the customers. So this basically deals with any IPR, intellectual property right, that has been given by a lessor as per the definition of IFRS 15. So it should qualify the definition of IFRS 15. Now, I will stress on the fifth point because I find it a bit confusing and it is quite realistic as well. So let's stick to the fifth point. What standard wants to say is rights held by, I'm not going to go through the standard, I'm going to explain it what it is. Rights held by the lessees under any leasing arrangement. So what they did is like they just gave, I'm discussing the fifth point here. So they gave two exemptions. One exemption is mandatory. Another exemption is optional. So any intangible assets, I'm going to denote intangible assets as IA. Okay. Any intangible assets, basically they are qualifying the definition of IAS 38 under intangible assets. Any intangible assets which are obtained by the lessee as a part of a lease agreement, and it's basically related to any motion pictures or any video recording or any manuscript or any patent or copyright. So this basically covers under this section. So anything, any of the following assets, there may be a motion picture, it may be a manuscript, it may be a video recording or patent, copyright, anything. If these things are covered, these things a lessee get through the help of a lease, so these are mandatorily exempted. Like this does not form part of the IFRS 16. So if the lessee gets these kind of items or these kind of assets, they don't need to apply IFRS 16. But any intangible assets apart from this, any intangible assets, as far as IAS 38, any intangible asset apart from these assets will cover here, which means the exemption is optional. The lessee may not apply IFRS 16 for these assets. So I'm gonna it's a bit confusing. I'm gonna explain it again. Just do not stress on the fourth part. Do not stress on the fourth part. Just think about the fifth part. The fifth exemption. The fifth exemption is any right held by a lessee under a leasing arrangement within the scope of IAS 38 for assets such as motion pictures, video recording, plays, manuscripts, and copyrights. Okay, so you took a lease. For example, you're a lessee, you took a lease, and this lease this lease is basically related to any motion pictures or any video. So this standard is not applicable, period. Which means the standard is not applicable itself. So there's no point of there is no point of having a choice for the lessee to apply IFRS 16. So it is excluded from the scope. Apart from that, any intangible asset which do not form part of, which is not motion pictures, VR, or a manuscript, the lessee may not apply IFRS 16 may not apply. So they have an exemption here. So it's the discretion of the lessee not to apply the standard. So it's an exemptions given to lessee itself. So this is a mandatory and this is an optional. So I think this is okay. Now let's move into the third item, and there are certain key aspects that you need to look into. There is certain special considerations that we need to look into. The first point is long-term leases of land. So any long-term leases, IFRS 16 does not specifically exclude long-term leases of land. So any long-term leases which covers land, so it's form part of IFRS 16. Another point, leases of investment properties. It's a bit complex areas to deal with. So first of all, if any property under IFRS 16 it's recorded as a right to control the use of a particular asset or right to use a particular asset, and if it's an investment property, which means they have to amend the definition given under investment properties. So investment properties also given on lease also covers under IFRS 16. So which means if someone is applying IFRS 16 as on a particular lease, the same need to amend the definition as per IAS 40 as well. So another point that I want to communicate is if the lessee is following, okay, let me go through it very slow. If a lessee applies the fair value model, okay, IAS 40 gives two models. First is the cost model, or they can use the fair value model for its own investment properties. Then in such a case, it requires the fair value model to be used for a right of use the particular asset that meets the definition of investment properties. So here it is. Give me a minute, I'm going to explain it again. Cancel, new, investment property. Okay, IAS 40 gives the holder or asset holder gives two options. Either they can go for the fair value model, or they can go for the cost model to account for investment properties. Simple. Now, if someone is going for the fair value model, they need to apply the same in all the classes of assets, of investment properties. Hence, my point is, if the accounting policy of the lessee is to account for any investment property at fair value, then any right to use a particular asset capitalized as per IFRS 16 need to be recorded at fair value. This is the change. So which means any investment properties falls within the scope of IFRS 16. Again, if the accounting policy of the lessee is to account for the investment properties under fair value method, then in such a case they need to apply the fair value method for the right to control the use of a particular asset. So this is the basic thing that they want to communicate. The third point, leases of inventories. So one may say that inventories should be excluded from the part of IFRS 16. No. So any leases for inventories are also within the scope of IFRS 16, but it's a very rare circumstance. And the fourth one is the subleases also. So subleases also falls part of the IFRS 16. And the fifth one is short-term leases and leases of fair value leases of low value items. Pardon me. So the fifth one is a bit important because it applies to every, which means even if one complies by the definitions of the leases and it's not falling part of the exclusion, but there's an exemption, or there's a I'm not calling practical expedient, because there's an exemption given that if it is a low value item or a short-term leases, it won't cover under IFRS 16's requirement for leases. So this is an overall view on scoping part. So IFRS 16 scoping. IFRS 16 applies to all the leases. The leases, it has a specific definition given under IFRS 16. So it's not applicable for oil and gas, natural resources leases, because it's covered under IFRS 6. The second one is IAS 41. Any biological assets, leases for any biological assets is not covered under IAS 41. Under IAS 41, especially for the bearer plans. The bearer plans are excluded from IAS 41, so they form part of PP&E IAS 16. So IFRS 16 is also applicable for the bearer plans. Service concession arrangements, IFRIC 12, it's not covered. Then intellectual properties given by the lessor and as per IFRS 15, revenue from contract with the customers. The fifth one is a bit confusing. They have mandatory exemptions and they have optional exemptions, especially any intangible assets in the nature of copyright, patent, manuscript, any motion pictures, video recordings. So they are automatically excluded, or they have a mandatory exemptions and they are not falling part of leases. However, the lessee has the option not to apply IFRS 16 for other intangible assets which meets the definition of IAS 38. Special areas of consideration: so long-term leases of assets, it's covered. Long-term leases of land is covered. Leases of investment properties is also covered, but fair value methods need to be taken into account for both lease assets and for the investment properties. Third, leases of inventories is also covered. Subleases are also covered. And there is an exemption given for short-term leases and low-value items. These are not covered under like any assets which have a short-term lease, generally for less than 1 year, and the low value items, which means less than 5,000 USD. So these are certain areas that we need to look into before applying IFRS 16. Oh, okay. Thank you guys. Thank you. Bye bye.